Welcome to the All Things DER podcast, brought to you by AEIC. In this podcast, we dig in, define, and discuss where the new energy economy is heading with electric industry leaders and explore all the ways that distributed energy resources can modernize and improve our ever-evolving power grid. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, AEIC DER podcast listeners. This is Dr. Elizabeth Cook, your host, and today we're going to jump right in with a very exciting guest, Michael Jung, who's the Executive Director of the ICF Climate Center. Welcome, Michael. How about you take an opportunity to kind of introduce what you guys are doing over there at ICF within the Climate Center, and we'll jump in.
Thanks for having me here. It's nice to catch up with you, to reconnect with you. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk about what we're up to at the ICF Climate Center. Some of your folks may know or recognize ICF. It's a consultancy. It's a big one, almost 9,000 people, 80 offices around the world. We do a ton of stuff in the EE space, in particular when it comes to utilities, as well as resilience planning and infrastructure planning. ICF really began as a force to do some good, and it continues to be that force today. We do consulting in healthcare and education, energy and climate. If it's a hard problem, we're here to help our clients solve it. The ICF Climate Center, however, is a new initiative. It's maybe best thought of as a think tank within the consultancy. We get to ask the questions that we wish our clients would ask us. We get to be the ones that are a little ahead of the curve. And our clients are the public. We share our insights on our thought leadership with everybody, not just as client deliverables, which often don't see the light of day. And so it's a really fortunate position that I get to lead, 2,000 plus people who are doing cutting edge work. We did the first sea level change analysis for the US government. We continue to do the national climate assessment and greenhouse gas inventory for the US. We did the math behind the Montreal Protocol engagement that our country did. We've been there on the front lines doing this work for a long time. So we have a ton of experts, and me and my team get to ask the questions that we wish our clients would ask.
That's awesome. And it's kind of, pointed in regards to, all things DER, right? It's sometimes like, what are the dots that connect the distributed energy resources, which, when I think about it, it's really bringing all the parties to the table in the Mecca. And one big issue is really, what is our climate? How's it changing? And then really the technologies that we're actively deploying depend on that weather and the forecast of the weather, and ultimately how those assets will perform when they are installed. So there's a multiple cross-functional perspective when we're talking about distributed energy resources. And so one thing that we get into, quite a vast number of topics. I'm a data analytic geek where I just love to understand, how do we build these models? How do we then study the system so that we can ultimately build out the inevitable grid that we need and or technologies that we need to have this new future? So I guess you being ICF that gets to interact with the utility space itself, I'll ask you from your perspective, what trends of DER have you kind of been involved in, and really where's those discussions go, and how does it tie to the bigger goals of what your initiatives are?
Yeah, I'm so excited that you and I have been working on this from our respective positions in our careers for a long time, and suddenly it's coming into pretty sharp focus. What are we doing here at the distributed edge of the grid? I think the terms seem to be fluid still. DERs are continuing to be in play. I'm hearing virtual power plants more and more as a construct that is people are using to describe what I think has always been kind of DERs at its heart in a greater sense. But I'll share with you an observation that I think the most exciting part of this grid edge revolution maybe, is that not only the obvious stuff, right? So the Inflation Reduction Act and bipartisan infrastructure laws pumping a ton of money into this infrastructure that we're building that we need to get in place in order to deal with the climate that we're going to have to reckon with. We need it for mitigation. We also need it for resilience. And this is where I think it gets really interesting, because at the same time that we are putting so many eggs into the electric grid basket when it comes to climate change mitigation, we are also introducing new vulnerabilities and new demand for resilience from an infrastructure that, let's be honest about it, Elizabeth, it ain't no spring chicken. A lot of the infrastructure is at or past its expiration date from an engineering point of view. And we're asking it to do things it was never built to do. And so I look at distributed energy resources and I think to myself, and this is maybe controversial, a lot of folks, and myself included, are excited about how many more DERs are going to come out on the system. That's the glass half full side of it. And this is not glass half empty, because I think this is good news too. But another angle on it is, if we do it right, if we deploy these distributed energy resources logically, sensibly, and in a coordinated fashion, they become maybe the most powerful tool for avoiding having to build out a ton of other infrastructure that is going to be really hard to do even on a good day. I look at DERs, I look at the grid edge, and I think to myself, it's the best way to avoid having to build 30+% of the new transmission and the new generation and the new steel in the ground stuff. That's hard to site, it's hard to permit, it's hard to finance. And these DERs are going to help make the grid more resilient to the climate change that we're experiencing, at the same time that it helps us to mitigate the impacts that are going to make that climate change worse. It's the Swiss Army knife, and I'm super excited about it still.
Yeah, that resonates with me. One of my big goals, especially with this podcast and just everything I do, is really how to communicate, educate, and drive that general awareness of, do not look at a DER as something as an individual or a silo. So, we get stuck in this mud with, DER solar. But what we're truly talking about is innovative new ways of thinking of how to use energy. We were in a world where there was no such thing as electricity and how, lighting up our nights. So we're only 140 years out. So how can we start, when we talk about distributed energy resources, like the problems that it's solving? So like you went there and I'm going to go there too. So like on top of the intermittent and or dispatchable generation at the edge, which is your distribution grid, we also have the up and coming transportation electrification, as well as all of the electrified heating and cooling and all the new technologies that are making us more efficient in the use of energy. But there's a huge initial capital investment that's required to do that transformational change. And so you get that push and pull that like, okay, well, you're going to electrify the grid at the edge. Is the grid the current aged infrastructure that we've been, nurturing and doing our thing, I guess, and maintaining and inspecting and infrastructure in general? Do we need to rebuild it or overbuild it or continue to build it? And I agree with you. If we have the data and the sensoring and the measurements out at the edge communicating to us, we can manage it in a way that reduces that overall build out. And I think that also helps break up the very large grid into smaller grids, which makes the grid ultimately more resilient and combat, all of these climate, scares, taking out the large bulk electric grid. How can we give these individualized smaller grids, that resiliency and that reliability? So yeah, I'm just agreeing with you, and it's exciting.
Yeah, I mean, you and I are very much share that spirit. Let me point out two areas that I think we have to make sure we don't overlook as we go, set on this journey. The first that I'll point out is that I worry a little bit that the way that the incentives are structured and the way people think, the way we are organized as an industry, tends to be sort of linear. And so you end up having incentives for this widget or that technology. And then you have an organizational structure for utilities that say, okay, we're supposed to put X number of this in place or build out this many, of that. And the reality is that the benefits are cross-cutting. As an example, to make this concrete, energy efficiency. As an industry, ICF has been in the middle of it. We helped start, Energy Star at the beginning. My own personal experience has been that, in the last year, I put on rooftop solar, I've got an electric vehicle, and we installed a heat pump. I went on time of use rates at the same time that I have this net metering tariff in place. And so I called my utility, call center and said, hey, help me understand what my incentives should be. I'm on a time of use rate. And so I have a peak pricing, shoulder pricing and off-peak pricing, but I also have a net metering tariff. And I don't know how those two interact because the net metering tariff, is it time sensitive? To what extent is it time sensitive? I don't know. Can you help me? And the call center rep, God bless her, she didn't have the answer on her fingertips either. And it took us over an hour of her reaching up, me asking more questions, us doing some math together over the phone to figure out some basic level of understanding. And I recognize I'm a grid geek. I'm an early adopter. I'm asking questions before other people might think to ask them. But our utilities are going to have to start thinking less. And to add insult to injury, I'm on an inclining block rate. And so the energy efficiency incentive, the programs and pieces and policies that are, out there in order to incentivize me to use less energy may not be the right fit in an era where we're wanting people to electrify their transportation and their heating and cooling and whatnot.
Right.
So it's more complicated than our linear structures lend themselves to solving for. And so
And I think
that,
that's another reason for the education is right. Like, working inside utility and like working with the industry, it is a very linear logical perspective. Like, we don't want to change the system too much or bucket because we're risk averse, and we are selling a life commodity that's required for all. So how do we transform and really start seeing the whole ecosystem and baselining all of the different business engagements within a utility? So like everyone is assigned an asset, they're assigned a job, right? So they're very siloed in the way of how the parts work together over 140 years. And what I'm seeing though, and really what my passion is we have to go back to the building, the basics, the building block, the foundation, which is, okay, we have a grid. How is it being utilized? If you think about industry-wide, building those models and running those analytics to really speak to us have not yet happened. So when we're talking about replacing wires and transformers and metering and all of that in between, what is the end game? And how do you create that conversation with all of those doers that are keeping the lights on day to day? So like that whole idea of like, we have our core business and we're in the midst of transforming that core, and you got to do both at the same time. It's like a mecca.
yeah, that's
problem.
the trick.
And it comes down to humans and how humans behave, and what makes them understand the why behind the what. And creating that continuous flow of like information is I think our biggest challenge. So to your point, with all of your rates and the, what may persuade or change your human behavior as a customer is a dynamic that we have to deal with, as well as those that are trying to solve the problems inside the utility to like create that reality for you. It's like a double. I don't like to always talk about problems, but this one is very complicated.
Well, I'm Korean, and as an immigrant, the word in Korean for danger is 위험, and 위험 literally is two characters, we and hum. And the first character, we, means like threat, like something that like you have to be careful of, a risk. And hum kind of translates to opportunity. It's something that's positive. And so every danger presents an opportunity is an idea that I often embrace, and it shows up in my language. To add a third leg to the stool that you just described, though, this is kind of a three-part thing. The way that our industry is organized is, the regulatory compact, and in that you have a regulatory process, which is, if you boil it down, it's essentially a judicial proceeding. Regulators are like judges. There are plaintiffs and defendants and interveners, and it's essentially a zero-sum game for the most part, and in most cases. That works pretty well when the winners and losers, the beneficiaries and contributors and investors are fairly well established. The pieces aren't moving too much on the chessboard. But I would argue that today, given all of the challenges, the wee hums that we face, we're going to have to get really clever about figuring out ways to turn this zero-sum game, this sort of trench warfare of regulatory engagement, into something that allows for more collaboration and more creativity. And I think that's going to be maybe the hardest part, because the technologies are cool, but that's coming. Innovation is unstoppable. But how do we change the regulatory framework to allow for that innovation to come online? That might be harder than inventing the technology kind of gadgets.
And I also feel like a lot of the technology has been developed to a point where we can get started, right? You learn doing. And so you are right in regards to creating new products and services or new rates and approach of how does the business model of the utility in itself, state by state. The one thing, it's a catch-22 internally is like, okay, well, what's the business value? How is this offsetting, or how are you being more efficient? Or how will this drive human behavior to ultimately not impact and the key to that, and that's kind of is installing the technology to gather the data to run the analytics, to be able to say, look, if we have all these customers doing this, and we've never seen that, but we have them doing this at this time, and if they continue to do it on this trajectory, we're going to have issues. However, if we can shift or create this awareness where they understand the benefit to themselves as well as to all, the human behavior will change. But you really can't like start having those use cases and those like real tangible, fruitful conversations with not only the internal folk, but like the ownership, take it to the regulatory level, take it all the way into the legislation, writing the bills to change the tariff. It's a catch-22, but I think it all comes down to allowing the technology that gathers the data, runs the analyses, and then speaks to high levels, right? All the way up and down from the individual utility all the way up to the regulatory environment.
Well, this is why we need folks like you at Duquesne Light helping to lead the way. You guys are doing such great work in terms of understanding how the grid edge actually functions, building digital twins so that we can actually, model and simulate, which is way less risky than trying to make that happen at scale in real time. I think that, the power of, we talked about virtual power plants, earlier in the conversation. I think digitally twinning our entire utility infrastructure and then modeling out, what kinds of changes might we expect from consumer behavior, from infrastructure operation? How do we merge the time horizon or the traditional time horizon of planning and have that intersect with the other time horizon of operations?
Yeah.
This is going to be an area where I think, digital technology, virtual utilities may help us to de-risk what is otherwise a really scary proposition. I've heard people describe utility transformation as, trying to change the wheels on a car that's moving at highway speed as you're going down the highway. And
right, and
it'd be nice to have a digitally safe way to do that.
And other industries have, right? Like rocket models, right? You actually build the engine itself and you run a plethora, if not millions of scenarios,
simulations,
and you determine if the design is best. So like,
yes,
we can't make these decisions until that type of technology is out there and available. And also getting those that see the North Star, in my opinion, right? Full situational awareness to the edge so that you're literally able to serve all, so we don't have the have and have nots, so that we're actively looking at the whole instead of just the parts. And I think, where we are today has been, sadly, because we only look at the parts, and the advancements we made in our industry has only been driven by mandates or requirements in these little silos, and not seeing how the whole, almost I think of a DNA helix, that like if you have like a data as a strategy, right? And you have all of your utility usage data in a cloud, and you literally can tie your interconnection process to your planning, to your asset management, to your engineering, to your fields, and back to ultimately the procurement and the prioritization of all spend. Like, it sounds impossible, but it's all there. And especially we've seen in all the other industries, but we need to have the allowance, the awareness that we want to change and be different and show up for our customers different. And that discussion's, it takes time, but do we have the time? So in the end, data, I think, is going to really provide these solutions to, what's your word that you used, or dangerous opportunities?
We hum.
There's the opportunity, tap into the data and understand how the system actually works.
Well, I'm glad that, I feel like, Elizabeth, that, what you're doing with Advanced Grid Solutions at Duquesne, is sort of digging the tunnel from one end of the mountain. And we at ICF are working on tools that are helping to dig another tunnel from the other end of the mountain. And if we do it well, they will intersect and we'll find a way through. I love that, the digital twinning and the grid edge, work that you guys are doing is really illuminating for the first time what previously was, a paper and pencil exercise when it comes to distribution grid, planning and operation. And what we're doing at ICF, we've developed these technology tools that build the intersections between the physics of power flow on the grid and the economics of power markets and how it's priced, and the geography in terms of the resources available in each place, and then the demography of who lives in those places and what are their needs. And that all becomes a policy, it feeds into that policy intersection of what incentives are available, what tools are available. So we're building tools to help site this infrastructure that will then complement, we're going to try to meet you in the middle of the mountain, with the kind of tools that we're building.
Yeah, because, trying to bring it all together, you have the utility in their infrastructure and what it is, but then all the layers that you just spoke of is a part of the ultimate, like, mecca of how do you plan and ensure that we are present and able to continue to serve the safe, reliable, affordable power. So it's very exciting to hear about the tools that you're creating and really that awareness and how that drive is coming from the other side. So I look.
And it actually happens behind the meter as well. You guys are doing such a good job of using your smart meters for more than just metering. and taking the data, the power quality and the voltage data, and helping to light up the visibility on your end. And we're building tools that help to show off what is happening behind the meter. We have technologies that really kind of enable us to digitally twin essentially the behind the meter behavior, as especially like everyone talks about the duck curve in California, and I feel like it's a useful way to get people to pay attention to that challenge, but it's also misleading because the dip in in that curve is not an actual dip. It's actually just this vacuum of data that is real. It's out there on customer side generation, behind the meter generation. Right. And so, it's revealing to me. I look at the duck curve and I think to myself, this is showing off just how siloed we still are, because we don't have a holistic understanding of what's in front of the meter and what's behind the meter. That is the system really. And we're using an old framework and continuing to misunderstand it as a result.
Right. And I think, I think we could talk forever, but two things, how we serve our customers. We always just say the customers there, we shall serve, but like we're flipping the switch is like the customer, the building are becoming an asset to help serve all. So like no more of this individualized thinking. It's really important that we have to understand how we serve all of these buildings, aka customers. Each one of them could take part in the overall capability of closing this gap that we're going to see when we start electrifying and then deploying all these technologies. So I was going to throw a question out to you. I know in our previous conversations, you always gave great book recommendations. In the world that you're living in now, is there any ones that kind of jump out of and you would recommend to our listeners?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. I finished a book recently that has had a profound impact on me that I'm still processing. And so I'll kind of share it in real time. I generally, as you know, I'm a nonfiction reader. I tend to look at books that are, fantasy and fiction. I think, what's the point of that? It didn't actually happen. But at the same time, it does expand our minds. And so the book that I read recently is a fiction book called Overstory by Richard Powers. Overstory, I don't even know how to sum it up, but it's kind of a story about human experiences, but told through not the lens, but on the time horizon of trees. And every time I take a walk in my backwoods now, every time I go hiking or backpacking now, I see the trees around me in a different way. And I think of myself differently in relation to the natural environment that I've always adored and admired. But admittedly, a part of us as humans, we just take a lot of it for granted. And this has really changed the way I see the world in a literal sense. I'm still processing it, but it was profound. And also just beautiful writing, haunting phrases that I still kind of chew in my head.
I love it.
Yeah, so that would be my recommendation for a book that has changed the way I've thought in ways that I'm still kind of figuring out. How about you?
I'm all over with books, but I guess something similar was Life in Five Senses by Gretchen Rubin, who I fell in love with her when she wrote The Happiness Project. So it just got released. And I just love how she just breaks down the world around her and really simplifies, how to take in life and just enjoy those moments. So yeah.
Oh gosh, sounds like I could definitely use a bit of that reflection. I tend to move too fast to pause and soak it all in. So thanks for that recommendation.
Well, I love this conversation, and I just want to wrap it up. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to our continued contribution and kind of changing utility, change the world, that perspective. So.
That's a wrap for this week's episode of All Things DER. Thanks for tuning in. We hope today's conversation got you thinking about new and creative ways to improve our power grid. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to be the first to hear new episodes. This podcast is brought to you by AEIC, the place where operations leaders come together to share knowledge and provide guidance to the electric utility industry. We'll be back with a new episode soon. Until then, keep powering on.